Well, good morning. I'm Jackie from Sheridan Strategy, and today I have with me a special guest. Her name is Shanae Swart, and she comes from Pretoria, back in my home country, South Africa. Shanae is a reauthoring diversity and inclusion coach, and she runs a bunch of workshops for organizations and community projects to assist people in reauthoring their story using narrative techniques. Now, why I wanted to have Shanae on our meeting today is that there are some interesting concepts that she's working with. She tells a little bit about her own story if you go and follow her on LinkedIn, and she talks about the work that she's doing, some of the workshops that she's doing through this diversity and inclusion projects. And I'm going to let her tell us about that work and then head into some questions for her. So welcome, Shanae.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful connecting over the oceans. I just love technology. How precious is that? Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us.
So I started with narrative therapy ideas in the beginning of 2000 when I studied, and I was asked to work in organizations from 2005. So for me, then the whole translation of these ideas really started, because I worked with leaders and managers who wasn't interested even in the word story or narrative, and definitely not in anything that sounded like psychology. So I thought, well, how could these ideas be accessible to ordinary people without excluding them? How can I include them with kind of language and practices? And over the years, I've done various workshops to try out how to include people. What are ways where people can access these ideas without feeling that, oh my goodness, this is only for people with this kind of language, especially excluding language. So how can we see one another with our gifts in this, what Michael White called human beings have this amazing capacities to make meaning and to make story. Those two capacities, and those people just don't know that we have that. So for me, that was this amazing discovery. And so how can we use that when we work with people? And so out of my own curiosities grew workshops, and I've designed 6 workshops that I think that would help people and include them into the ideas, and diversity and inclusion is one of those 6 workshops. And for me, that's a super important one in the world that we are living in particular, because Derrida, the French philosopher, talks about, he says there can not be any other without language. That we firstly construct the other in the names that we give to the other. And so for me, that's at the heart of what some of the biggest dilemmas in our world, I think, is that we have othered one another to the point that we have then also dehumanized them. So that we can go with a little ship to another country and think that we can take over there. That this is not an other worth being a dignified human being. And so we sit with the remains of that. We also have that in the othering. In wonderful example currently is Greta Thunberg. Children should be heard, seen and not heard. There are definitely another that shouldn't be marching and should go to school. And so the millennials, oh dear, we have them in our work. They sound like a disease. And that's another other we have constructed in language. And then we just throw the blanket over all the others and say all of them are like that. And so we don't have the uniqueness then of people showing up, because they've been covered in this label, in this language, and in all the meaning that goes with that. And so some of the practices in our workshops that we explore is our own cultural identities, which is sometimes a difficult thing to describe, because me as an Afrikaner woman in this country, you know, the Afrikaans is, it was the language of the oppressor. It was also Afrikaners inventing and practicing and institutionalizing apartheid. So what does that mean for my cultural identity then? Mm-hmm. So we have all things that we are proud of in our cultural identities and things that we would rather forget mm-hmm. and not mention. So we live in this complexity also with cultural identities. But what are the gifts that we bring, and what are the things that we also want to distance ourselves maybe from? In that sense, and then understanding that the other is created over time, through history, through taken for granted beliefs and ideas. And then here in South Africa, we have the wonderful gift, my colleague who does these workshops with me, we had a conversation about the stranger, welcoming the stranger. And we were sitting around the room, and there were different African languages in the room. And they just said, we don't have a word for stranger. It does not exist. In isiXhosa, it's uhambi, the one that travels, the one that walks, you know, and so I find it fascinating, you know, how did we come to construct the other also, not only as the other, but also as the stranger? Mm-hmm. And then the whole idea of welcome. How can we welcome one another? What are the practices of welcome? What are the practices where we can be connected in the web of stories beyond you are this and I am that, because of all the labels, languages, practices? So those are some of the ideas that we discover and work with in the workshop. And South Africa is such a wonderful place, a vibrant place where we are not faint at heart, having real conversations.
Yes. And with lots of diversity to go with it.
Exactly. We're not confused about where we are in the world.
So one of the questions that I wanted to tap into, if you don't mind, is more on your personal story. You once mentioned that narrative for you changed the way you handled the problem, from being the object of problem-solving exercise to being the author of naming your own story in your own way. And I find that fascinating, because that's one of the things that attracted me to narrative therapy, is that we, as therapists, we stop putting the other person as a problem to be solved, and rather just change it to give them the power to have a story and to be able to tell that story as best they possibly can, and in the way that they want to tell that story. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your own experience with this, and maybe work
Sure.
with that?
So I was very small when I wanted to become a therapist. So I remember going to my library in Port Elizabeth and reading all of these therapy books when I was still very small. And then in my own life, I got stuck in the story, and none of these stuff helped. And all of the people around me seemed to know what's wrong with me. You know, whoever I talked to, they would always have like a string of advice, and if only you're not like so oversensitive. And I ended up feeling that I am the problem. Mm-hmm. And when you come to that place, you feel that, well, the only way to solve this problem is if I depart this world, then it's fixed and solved. Until I got connected with narrative ideas. I remember we were sitting in a living room of a good friend of mine. He said, found this new kind of therapy. Am I interested? And I said, yes, try it on me. I'm desperate. So I was so grateful, because just the situation of the questions, firstly, it wanted to know from me what was my experience of the problem. That was new. And then it asked me what I would name. It didn't have a diagnosis for me ready. And then the way the questions was asked, I realized that I was in relationship to this problem. And it was one of many stories of my life. It wasn't the only story. And I think it's particularly challenging in our world where we have labels for so many problems and sicknesses and diagnoses, and we see somebody react in some way, and then everybody's like the local people. You don't even have to go to a therapist because they've already got a label for you, because the magazine I'm reading saying this is what your problem is. And so we go around sticking labels on everybody, and we don't give them the possibility and the opportunity to have a conversation of discovery of their own meaning making. And I think the biggest dilemma in our world is that problems are then divorced from a whole context that keeps them alive and well. And so what I was stuck in wasn't something in my head being oversensitive about. It was a whole culture of beliefs and ideas about who a woman is and how she should speak and what she should be busy with and not busy with. And that was never addressed in any conversation that I was in. So for me, that was the biggest gift of narrative ideas, is that it situates problems within a particular context with beliefs and ideas and practices that have come over years. And then one can distance and say, well, how do I want to be in relationship to this world with all of these beliefs and ideas? I remember I was doing a leadership workshop with a group, and I was explaining this whole idea of this whole world that's constructed with beliefs and ideas. And I remember this woman came to me over tea time, and she was like crying, and it was tears like this. It wasn't like flowy tears. And she was saying, why haven't anybody told me this before? Because for years she was thinking that she's crazy. There was a whole world telling her a good girl is like this, a successful girl is like this. And she played that part in a particular context also. And I think the other dilemma is that we then call those things limiting beliefs. As if, or again, then we're making that person again the problem, saying, oh, you're just limiting yourself, or you just have limiting beliefs about yourself. There's a whole world that keeps things in place. Yeah. And that needs to be exposed. Sorry, that's my.
No.
About that one.
Right. Like I'm listening to you as a woman and going, oh my gosh, I resonate. I think that's one of the discourses that I learned to push back against is this true for me? Is this really true for me? That women are supposed to be in this certain frame of mind. I grew up thinking, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she was like, you should look after your husband. And I was like, is this true for me? Because that's not my personality. I don't like to sew and be that person. So yeah.
Yeah, in Afrikaner culture, it's called sitting pretty. Yes. There's a whole book written about that.
Yes.
Being proper.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. So one of the questions I love that you mentioned in another posting of yours is, what are you teaching the problem? And I love that question. It's such a powerful dynamic to say you have something, that you have an input rather than just the problem having an effect on you. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I was busy in my studies when I was exploring this, what I then called silent servant narrative. And oh man, and I think I was in mourning. I just felt that I cried every time. So I was putting up my hand in class for the supervisor, Elmarie Kotze, kind of try it on me. And I just remember myself with a box of tissues. And then And then she asked this question, so what are you teaching? Silent servant. And I'm like, I'm teaching her something. It was revolutionary. I mean, so many years, 20 years later, I still remember that question. Because with in our relationship with problem stories, we are influencing the problem, and the problem is influencing us. And there's never, and I think this is what Michael White said, there's never a total takeover. And that's the beauty of this work. There's always this moment, even just for a second, where you taught her something, or you didn't go somewhere, or you did go somewhere. I remember somebody said once, you know, so what happens if there's nothing? Then I can't remember if it was Michael saying, well, you came to this session, does that say something? And then sometimes even that we took ourselves to somebody, a total stranger, and would have a conversation with somebody is evidence of a teaching, is evidence of your protest. Michael White called it the acts of refusal and protest. We are never fully taken over by problem stories. There's always the small act of resistance that shows up, and in conversations you see it with people, they kind of light up. I just had a conversation just now where it was slow paced, dreary, stuckness. But then when this refusal showed up, this person was sitting up straight, even spoke differently. And so you see it in the body. The body shows the acts of resistance, and the eyes light up. It's wonderful to see.
Yeah, those are the aha moments that every counselor looks for when you're having those conversations.
And you're so privileged to be there.
Yes.
I always think, you know, you're the first community member that come alongside those acts of refusal and protest, and celebrate them with people. Yeah, absolutely. We're so privileged.
I'm going to ask you to take me to a moment when you've been working with an organization on inclusivity, and they suddenly, as an organization, get that aha moment. Could you tell me about something that happened recently?
It's not that recent though.
Okay.
But the one that's coming up is that we were working with a school here in South Africa where allegations of racism was made, and it was wonderful when we started including the pupils to say, if you would think of moments in your history as a school where you showed up in an inclusive way, where would that stories in the history be? And the whole group of them came together and constructed the story of their acts of refusal over even apartheid state many moons ago. And then what we did in this particular case, and I think for me, sometimes as a community, we don't have moments. Maybe in history we do, but sometimes the problem story is so overtaking us in that moment that we have to create alternative moments together. And so what we did is the whole school came together, 2,000 of them, all the admin people, the staff, the pupils, parents who wanted to join, and we had a gathering on the hockey field for 4 hours. And I remember some of the pupils saying, because we asked them to write down a moment that you want more of in the school. And some of them couldn't remember. They said, but this is the moment.
Wow.
The moment that we are coming together. So sometimes in organizations, I feel we also have to collectively create moments of an alternative that would give us the imagination of the possibility of how we could live differently and inclusively with one another.
that's
Is that an answer to your
no,
question?
that's fantastic. And it's, it's so interesting because I posted a quote today from Stephen Covey, and it says that we have to live in our imagination, not in our past. And that's exactly what you were saying now, is that when we live in our imagination, we can re-author our past different. Yeah.
Yeah. And they also had the moments in the history, but they weren't their moments. They weren't their current living moments. They were just too far for them to draw on. But they were there. And because they were there, we could gather in a different way and imagine a different future. So that's very exciting. It was a wonderful, we ended with a Kadesa dance together, everybody hopping like this. It was a magical day.
That sounds fantastic. Your work sounds so interesting. I'm actually wishing that I was a bit closer to come and be part of it some days.
Whenever you're here, you're welcome.
Offer. So one last question, and then I'll let you go. Organization and community work. Communities are so important, especially here in Canada. I noticed that we have a large immigrant population, so there is a lot of diversity, but not always a lot of community that brings us together. Could you just share one piece of advice or one tip that you would love to share with Canadian immigrants to help them build community in their new home?
So I'm thinking of lots of things, because I was there in Halifax in June. So they have a How We Thrive conference. And it's diverse people from different communities in Nova Scotia that come together and say, and the question is, how do we thrive together? And what we experience, and maybe I facilitated a whole gathering last year, and I would just draw on that. So they went, the first day, second day, they went out to the community to see alternative stories of community engaging. There was I think a Christian and a Muslim community, a kind of coming together around faith, for example, was one of the examples. And then when we gathered, I said, take us to a moment in the smaller groups that people were talking, when you saw a glimpse of a different Nova Scotia. Just for a moment, a glimpse. And then they shared that with one another, and we put it on a big flip chart saying, reauthoring how we thrive. And for me, I'm thinking of so many examples now. So there are different spaces where we can invite one another in to build the bridges to the other. Narrative is a bridge to the other, to bring us into one another's worlds. So it could be around food. There is Duncan Ibata has a community oven in a little town that I can't remember, the Wolfville. I'm so afraid I'm saying it wrong. But everyone gathers around the oven and have conversations. And those are diverse communities coming together, having conversations, meeting one another around food, for instance. That's an example of unothering the other. So I would say, whatever your passion is around music, around food, are all spaces where we can share stories. And when we've heard the story of the other, and we open ourselves to be touched and moved by it, we can never be the same. We realize how we connected in the web of stories. And your story also becomes my story, and my story becomes your story. And I think gathering in spaces around food, making something, music, the arts, I think, would give us the opportunity to unother the other, I think.
I agree 100% with you. And I love the way you say that it gives us time. Your story becomes my story, and my story becomes your story. And I think that's an important part of building community with each other. is that individual stories connecting with each other.
And if you want, I can also give you some details if people want to connect with these alternative communities. I've trained some people in Halifax, 2.5-day workshops, but Duncan in particular in this community around the oven is trying narrative reauthoring ideas out in the conversations around the table.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm learning a lot from you today, just listening to you. And thank you so much for your time. Before we wrap things up, is there anything else you would love to share with us?
I just came from a call now where somebody was saying there's such negativity. We so often hear, this is just the way things are, things will never change. And how do we work with alternative stories in our world? How do we work with the other stories? The problem stories largely of our world is so big and so overwhelming and so important. And I was reminded of Trevor Noah, who was interviewed in, I think it was called The Future of Everything, a Washington Post gathering. And they asked him about how do you see yourself in 10 years? Typical question about the future. And then he said, I don't think like that. What I'm asking myself rather is, how am I engaging with the world right now that would give me a different future? And I think this is the invitation to us all. So how can we reauthor the stories that we are all connected to right now that would give us an alternative future? And I think that's, for me, the joy and the possibility of this work.
I am so inspired listening to you today.
Thank you.
And I really thank you so much for meeting with me. I know that it's you're probably ready to head into the weekend and have a good weekend.
Indeed.
Thank you for this time. And
pleasure.
And we'll connect soon.
Thank you so much for the privilege. Lovely day to you.
Thanks, Shanae.